Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I wasn't sure I could, at my age, do an all-night flight and still be coherent in the morning, so I wrote out my talk, but I think I'll be coherent. I wanted to take this occasion to congratulate and wish best wishes to Kristalina and her new job, which is clearly very important. She's emphasized she's the first head of the IMF for an emerging market, and that is a major change in our global landscape. I want to also congratulate and wish wishes to Minister Guzman. And to Professor Simagni, who's undertaken the role of the head of PASS, Pontifical Academy of Social Science. It's also a real pleasure to be in this room in which there have been so many important discussions, including, I just want to note one important meeting that we had, a joint meeting, an unusual one, a joint meeting between the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that preceded the papal encyclical that has been so influential on environmental and social justice. And I think you can think of this seminar as a continuation of that discussion. And the encyclical emphasizes the fact that you cannot separate environmental justice and social justice. And I think what we're really focusing on here is social justice, but I'll have a number of remarks to make about environmental justice as well. So let me begin. First, capitalism is in crisis. Indeed, today our world faces a multiplicity of crises, a climate crisis, an inequality crisis, and a crisis of confidence in our institutions, including our political and economic systems. Particular countries face still more crises. The U.S., an opioid crisis, a childhood diabetes crisis, and a crisis in our political institutions. Argentina, a debt crisis. There is also a moral crisis that some of the people talking before me have also emphasized. It's so evident both in our politics and our economics. Business leaders in the single-minded focus on the bottom line have displayed remarkable moral turpitude. Financial sector with its predatory lending, market manipulation, abusive credit card practices, the Dieselgate scandal in the automobile sector, a food industry contributing to childhood diabetes, pharmaceutical companies pushing addicted drugs even as they claim otherwise, Facebook willing to provide a platform for mis- and disinformation and political manipulation regardless of the consequences for our democracy, has shown the dangers of a privately controlled monopolistic surveillance economy. And with the divides within some countries so large, it is clear we also have a crisis in solidarity. That we face so many crises at once seems paradoxical. We are so much richer than we were before. We claim that we know so much more than we did before, that we have learned from advances in science, social sciences, and from studying history. But on closer reflection, perhaps, we should not be surprised. There is always a dialectic process at work. In the very process of solving one set of problems, we create a new set. Only hubris might lead some to have claimed that the fall of the Iron Curtain marked the end of history, and the countries would all quickly converge to liberal democracies and market economies, or to suggest that the problem of economic fluctuations had been solved. Democracy in societies with high levels of inequality and without adequate social solidarity creates its own conundrums, which some countries have figured a way around, but evidently the U.S. has not. The self-interested wealthy who wish to perpetuate their wealth have to form unholy political alliances with extremist groups to maintain political power. But even then, they have to do still more to keep their riches, like political manipulation and increasing disenfranchisement and voter suppression, which undermine democracy. While there are multiple sources of these crises, if I had to pinpoint one, it is a belief in unbridled and unfettered capitalism that grew in the latter third of the 20th century. The irony is that these ideas gain popularity just when economic science has shown the limits of markets through the work of Kenneth Arrow and Gerard Debreu, as Professor Zamani has just pointed out. Market failures were pervasive and persistent. My own work with Bruce Greenwald showed that the reason that Adam Smith's invisible hand was invisible was that it wasn't there. Economies with imperfect information and incomplete markets, that is all economies, were not efficient. The neoliberal or market fundamentalist economic doctrines got reflected in a policy agenda that has had devastating consequences for both developed and developing countries. These Washington consensus policies were imposed on many of the poorest countries, causing a lost decade in Latin America and a lost quarter century in Africa because of the structural adjustment programs that saw to that region's deindustrialization. Shock therapy in the economies of transition led to neither growth nor democracy in most of the countries of the former Soviet Union and Eastern and Central Europe. Neoliberalism gave rise to financial deregulation that eventually led to the most serious global economic downturn in 3/4 of a century, and it also resulted in a mismanaged globalization which served corporate interests, but neither the workers in the banks nor the developing countries. What was supposed to be something that would make everyone in every country better off became the subject of vilification in both the North and the South. Financialization and globalization created a few winners, but many, many more losers. The increase in inequality, the destruction of our environment, the polarization of our societies, and the pervasive discontent, these cannot be denied. There are multiple forces at play, of course. Changes in technology, what is called skill-biased technological change, also played a role. But the direction of technology is itself endogenous, a result of market forces, and capitalism directed its energy to creating more unemployment and lowering the wages of unskilled workers rather than to what it was really needed, saving the planet and creating an economy that would serve all. The distorted economy distorted politics and society. While standard economic theory takes individuals' preferences and behavior as fixed and largely universal, with choices affected only by economic variables like prices and income, we know otherwise. As parents, we work hard to raise honest, less selfish, and more caring children. An economic system based solely on self-interest that celebrates that greed is good, in the infamous words of Gordon Gekko, leads to a society in which individuals are greedier. By contrast, cooperatives, which Professor Zamani has devoted so much of his time to studying, cooperatives encourage cooperative behavior. Research in behavioral economics has established that bankers, especially when they are primed to think of themselves as bankers, are less honest than others, and even less honest than when they are not primed. So too, behavioral economics has shown how our economy, with its extremes of inequality, has bred a society lacking in solidarity, with those at the top believing that they are entitled, including entitled to flout the rules of society, and those at the bottom so discouraged they lack aspiration to achieve their potential. Such sentiments, including the feeling that the system is rigged, naturally spill over into our politics, marked not just by increasing polarization, but in which information and disinformation is increasingly viewed as a legitimate weapon, at least by those struggling to maintain their privileged position. In short, there is a nexus between self-interest and ideology, in which economic interests shape beliefs, shape individuals, shape politics, and shape the economy and society in ways that, if allowed to continue, could result in a dystopia that would not appeal to our higher selves. If unchecked, it would enhance and perpetuate the crises to which I referred earlier. Another world is possible, and most of the rest of this talk focuses on what that world might look like. The good news is that people increasingly recognize that capitalism needs to be reformed. The problem is that too many seek only minor tweaks, while what is required is much greater. For instance, at least in some parts, business and political leaders are mouthing commitments to a better environment, better access to education, and even occasionally more equality. But when it comes to making the deep and lasting changes that would have created a society marked by sustainable social and environmental justice, that often appears a road too far. Markets, including financial markets, international markets, will be part of any successful system, but key will be restoring balance. Balance between collective action, which has been denigrated, and markets, which has been put on a pedestal. Between markets and non-market institutions like cooperatives and NGOs, and between markets, the state, and civil society. All institutions are fallible. The potential for abuse of power is universal, and each of these institutions must check each other, but in constructive ways, in ways that do not lead to gridlock and paralysis. The difficulty is that when inequalities within society become too great, systems of checks and balances will not work, no matter how good the institutional arrangements might look on paper. Wealth will triumph. I've described a system called progressive capitalism that aspires to create a better balance, a capitalism that is markedly different from the unfettered or lightly regulated system of today. Progressive capitalism recognizes, first, that without regulation, firms in seeking profits can enhance those profits often more easily by exploiting others through the exercise of market power or taking advantage of others' vulnerabilities than by contributing to society, and we have seen that repeatedly. We need regulations. All societies require regulations because what one individual does can impose harms on others. The Ten Commandments were a simple set of regulations for a simple society. We have a far more complicated society with many more ways by which one individual can harm another. Stoplights are a simple regulation to control traffic flow. Without them, cities would be in gridlock. In reality, of course, the neoliberal deregulation agenda is really not about deregulation, but about having a different set of regulations, one that advances certain interests at the expense of others. While the banks argued against the regulations that might have stopped the financial crisis, they argued for a bankruptcy law that favored them over other creditors, and they argued for massive bailouts. Progressive capitalism also recognizes that we can do collectively things that we could not or would not do individually. And this is especially true as we move to an innovative society. Underlying the advances in our standards of living is basic research, and markets will simply not invest sufficiently in such public goods. To finance these public goods, there have to be taxes. And in a just society, these taxes have to be progressive, unlike the regressive tax systems that characterize some countries, including my own. Globalization has opened up new ways by which multinationals can avoid taxation, and a new race to the bottom, with particularly adverse consequences for the poor in developing countries. The international community has recognized at last that there is a problem, that it is deep. The transfer price system that has governed international taxation for a century is unsuitable for the 21st century digital, innovative, and service sector economy. The efforts so far, including the BEPS initiative, while moving in the right direction, are woefully inadequate. Of even greater concern is that recent proposals of a global minimum tax of some 12.5% would in fact lower tax revenues. It would become the de facto tax rate, starving developing countries of needed funds even more. There are many ways we act collectively, and not just through the government. NGOs, nonprofits, and cooperatives are among our important institutions. Much of America's success in innovation is attributable to its research and educational institutions, none of which are for-profit. Class action suits and collective bargaining are ways consumers and workers work together to advance their interests, checking corporate power. So much for the description of the current malaise and a diagnosis of its central causes. The good news is that there are alternative policies and economic and social frameworks that can lead to greater growth, and this growth can be consistent with our environmental constraints. We now understand that growth in social and environmental justice can be complements. We are in fact paying a high price for the extremes of inequality that mark many of our countries. The report of the International Commission on Carbon Pricing that I co-chaired with Nick Stern emphasized that reducing carbon can be a growth story. Europe's Green Deal lays out a framework for achieving net zero emissions by 2050, and achieving that too, I believe, is not only necessary for sustainability, but good for living standards. Elsewhere, I have argued that similar concerted efforts, in the U.S., some refer to the Green New Deal, to emphasize the scale and urgency of what must be done, can be a moment of societal transformation, just like World War II was, bringing to the economy groups that were previously marginalized. Here, I should make note of a seeming paradox in much of the popular discussion. Some say we cannot afford to make the urgent climate transition that we need. Others worry about how technological change, robotization, and AI will lead to large-scale unemployment. Some refer to secular stagnation, the notion that even at a zero interest rate, it is hard to sustain full employment and strong growth. As evidence, they look at the anemic growth in the U.S. and stagnating standards of living, despite a $1 trillion massive deficit, deficits that are expected to only increase over time. A few years ago, the head of the Federal Reserve talked about a savings glut. Evidently, we have too much labor and too much capital. Of course, these two views are totally inconsistent. We cannot claim simultaneously that we have a superabundance of resources, and we don't have enough resources to deal with climate change and the other urgent crises that I described earlier in this talk. What is preventing us from dealing with these crises is not a lack of resources, but failures in our market and political institutions. In my remaining minutes, I want to sketch out what needs to be done at both the national and global level. I begin with the former. We need a new social contract reflecting solidarity within our society and across generations, ensuring the better institutional balance that I described earlier. This will require, in particular, a larger and in some ways different role for government, less corporate welfare, more help for citizens who need it, more progressive taxation, and most importantly, we have to rewrite the rules of the economy, once again, to undo the way they were rewritten or reinterpreted during the era in which neoliberalism reigned. This is most obvious in the U.S., but many countries have followed America's lead. With colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute in New York and the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels, we have written 2 books detailing what needs to be done, Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy and Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, the latter just released last week. Let me mention just a couple of examples. We need new frameworks for corporate governance, new bankruptcy laws, new rules governing labor, affecting the extent of unionization and the effectiveness of collective bargaining. I use the term rewriting the rules broadly to include the rules governing monetary and macroeconomic policy. Monetary policy that focuses narrowly on inflation in a world in which unemployment and financial fragility is the central economic problem won't serve well the economies of the 21st century, nor will financial regulatory policies that don't recognize systemic risk, including that associated with transition climate risk, the possibility of a disorderly move towards a global economy in which the cost of carbon is at least recognized. Markets are myopic, often slow to see a seemingly inevitable future, as we saw in 2008. The systemic consequences of a change from a world with a price of carbon near zero to an appropriate price of carbon, estimated in the range of $100 a ton, will be highly disruptive to the global financial system, another reason for the imperative to act now. I should note the important work of the IMF and INET, including its research group in Zurich. The cumulative effect of each of these rules can be enormous, and we are now seeing the economic, political, and social consequences with more economic polarization, less social solidarity, and greater political divisions. However, even when we rewrite the rules, achieving greater growth within our planetary boundaries with more shared prosperity, we will require larger public expenditures, including on basic research, technology, infrastructure, and education. We have starved the public sector, while the world has, in many dimensions, engaged in profligate consumption and misguided investments. Estimates of the marginal private returns to public investment suggest that they are far higher than in the private sector. Even then, there will be many people whose standard of living is below subsistence and who unnecessarily face high levels of anxiety and insecurity. We need a 21st century social welfare system. The notion that markets are deficient in providing social protection and helping individuals through the various stages of their lives is hardly a radical idea. It has been a central part of the European social model, one that has led to higher living standards, better health, and longer lives than elsewhere in the advanced world. A 21st century social welfare system goes beyond social protection to recognize that there are a multiplicity of market failures beyond just the absence of good insurance markets. The economy often behaves markedly different from the way characterized by our simple models. The macroeconomy is often, for instance, marked by large macroeconomic inconsistencies, leading in some cases to debt crises with disastrous consequences for large parts of the population and a loss of social capital and societal trust. Today, countries make choices about their economic arrangements within the context of a global economy. Globalization has been mismanaged, and part of the reason is that the rules of the game have been flawed, often misguided by a neoliberal mindset. It should be obvious that we need an international rule of law. This is as important internationally as a domestic rule of law to the functioning of any economy, and the attempt to undermine the international rule of law is clearly counterproductive. Still, there are many possible global rules governing globalization, and the currently prevailing ones are fair neither to the poorest countries nor to workers within both the advanced and developing countries. That is part of the reason that there is such discontent with globalization, again, both in the developed and developing world. With so many finance ministers here today, though, I want to focus my remarks on certain aspects of the global financial and macroeconomic system. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, I was asked by the President of the UN General Assembly to chair an international commission of experts on reforms of the international monetary and financial system, the findings of which were supported in a special meeting of the General Assembly in 2010. We emphasized, for instance, the necessity of greater macroeconomic coordination. We suggested that this should be done through the creation of a Global Economic Coordination Commission. We note that a recent report of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF drew attention to the large macroeconomic externalities associated with the unconventional monetary policies undertaken post-crisis. My theoretical work with Martin Guzman emphasized especially the consequences emanating from the large countries like the United States. We have highlighted, too, the need for a framework for sovereign debt restructuring. Every country has a bankruptcy law, essential for addressing fairly and efficiently the all too frequent circumstances in which creditors cannot pay back, in which debtors cannot pay back in a timely way what they owe. Collective action clauses are not a substitute for a bankruptcy law. At best, they reduce the adverse consequences of the absence of such a law. We were pleased when the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly adopted a set of principles to guide such a global sovereign debt restructuring framework, but disappointed that a few of the largest countries, including the U.S., did not support these principles. Subsequent events, including the infamous rulings by Judge Grisa in the U.S. District Court, have demonstrated just how needed such a framework is. So, too, has the history of debt restructuring, repeatedly marked by too little, too late, excessive delays in restructuring with too few changes, resulting in another debt crisis within 5 years. In some half of the cases, an enormous and unnecessary suffering in the debtor country. The irony is that even the creditors lose. Had there been a more humane restructuring program, the debtor would have grown faster and been able to repay more. Current patterns of debt restructuring are lose-lose situations. Both the creditor and the debtor are worse off than they could be. Greece shows what can happen. A 25% decline in GDP, a 25% average unemployment rate in the years following the crisis, with youth unemployment exceeding 60%, with unemployment finally falling, in part because so many citizens, especially the young, having left the country. Society and an economy have been unnecessarily devastated, and in the end, there had to be a succession of debt restructurings. We typically blame the borrowers, but as I emphasized in the context of the East Asia crisis, Every loan has a willing borrower and a willing lender, and the lenders are supposed to be the more financially sophisticated, in a better position to assess the risks of repayment. There may be little benefit from playing the blame game. One should be looking forward and asking what to do now. But still, one cannot but conclude that if blame were to be assigned, it should go disproportionately to the lender. Sovereign debt restructurings are more complicated and more important than private restructurings for two reasons. First, there are a host of what might be called informal claimants: pensioners, children, the sick, people with disabilities, the public at large, all of whom have by right a claim in the resources of the country. Just because the contract between them and the government or society is a social contract, not a written contract, doesn't mean that the claims shouldn't be recognized. Indeed, many of these claims should be given priority. Within the United States, we recognize this in Chapter 9 of our bankruptcy law pertaining to public authorities. Secondly, how we manage sovereign debt restructuring inevitably has major macroeconomic consequences. That's the point I've emphasized earlier. Mismanagement is a negative-sum game. There's an old saw that one can't squeeze water out of a stone. If a country doesn't have the dollars to repay a dollar-denominated loan, something will have to give. 19th century debtor prisons didn't succeed in helping creditors get repaid, nor do 21st century austerity programs that attempt to starve a country by cutting down imports. Both policies were inhumane, both were counterproductive. Simple arithmetic tells us that there are but three ways of restructuring: postpone payments, reduce interest rates, and reduce principal, take a haircut. Some ways are better than others, both for the creditor and the debtor. Lowering interest rates charged reduces the probability of default, and with a lower probability of default, the lower interest rate is justified. There can be multiple rational expectations equilibria, especially in the presence of bankruptcy costs. One with low interest rates, one with high interest rates, with the former dominating the latter. Yet too often, financial markets gravitate to the latter, the high interest rate equilibrium. A sense of solidarity or even compassion and economic rationality, all of these should lead us towards the former, the low interest rate equilibrium. Charging a 9% interest rate in a world afloat with liquidity and with the negative interest rates in some countries might well be viewed as usury. But in New York State, that is the interest rate by law at which debt accrues in the case of debt in default pre-judgment. Interestingly, for a group with a presumed function of safeguarding global financial stability, 9% is also the interest rate the Paris Club is charging Argentina on its debt due in 2021. I hope that message gets conveyed to Minister Lemaire when he arrives later today. We won't be able to develop a new framework for sovereign debt restructuring in the next few weeks, but we have the opportunity in Argentina to show that there is an alternative approach to the one that has failed persistently in the past, a framework that simultaneously should appeal to notions of economic rationality and to our sense of social solidarity, a common humanity which at this point in history seems so under attack. I've had time to touch on only a few aspects of changes in the global and national economic frameworks that would enable us to move forward from this moment of crisis. Elsewhere, I've emphasized that inequality is a choice. It's not just a matter of the laws of nature or the laws of economics, but in large measure, it's a result of our man-made policies and laws. We have choices ahead. Those choices can reduce or increase our national and global divides. Those choices can increase or reduce trust and confidence in our economic and political systems. They can increase or reduce our sense of humanity and solidarity. Perhaps this moment of crises will finally bring a recognition that we have been making the wrong choices and set us on a different path. We have the opportunity to construct an alternative economic system, an alternative globalization. Those who have said another world is possible, one that puts people and values at its center, are right. Achieving this will not be easy because it necessitates a rebalancing of power within our society. This conference and the discussions that will follow could be an important turning point. Thank you. Very good.